So I'm going to talk for just a second about the exhibit itself. So What's Your Flavor will be on display at the Orange County Historical Museum through December of 2022. And the exhibit examines the history and art of cooking in Orange County. The exhibit itself identifies some common cooking ingredients and explains how people in the county acquired them. It depicts some ways local people use these ingredients. It also presents some implements owned by local people that were used to prepare and serve food, and it showcases how ingredients and culinary implements can inspire creative expression. There are also works of art on display in the local collection that is food related. And Courtney and Tanya, the museum staff, are going to take us behind the scenes today and show us how this exhibit was put together and explain their role as curators. So Courtney, without further ado, I turn it over to you.
Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the Orange County Historical Museum. I am the Exhibits and Programs Coordinator here, and I began working for the museum in June of 2020. And in that time, I have had the privilege of curating 4 exhibits here at the museum. One is our permanent exhibit, which is on the other side of the museum, and it takes a chronological look at the history of Orange County. And then on this side of the museum, we get to have a little more fun and do some special exhibits. So this exhibit is What's Your Flavor? And in terms of how it all began, we have an exhibits committee, a committee of the board, and they come up with the topic for the exhibit. And then I have to take that topic, that subject, and figure out how to execute that idea. So the idea that I was given was heritage cooking. And I said, wow, what a fantastic idea. So cool. People are going to be really interested in that. One problem. What do I put in the cases? Because as you will see soon, we have cases that are about 3 foot deep, 3 foot tall, some 8 feet long. And what kind of artifacts do we have? And the board said, oh, we have lots of artifacts. I said, yeah, we've got jam jars and meat grinders. We've got cast iron skillets. Who's coming in to look at that? A cast iron skillet from the 1800s looks the same as a cast iron skillet today. So I started scratching my head and figuring out, what am I gonna do? How am I gonna make this interesting to the guests who come into the museum? And so what I came up with, I used a little tagline, we were putting the art into artifact, was we worked with 8 artists from North Carolina, primarily Orange County, but some from outside the county, of diverse backgrounds, diverse mediums that they work in. And we asked them to go into the collection, look at the artifacts, choose one or more artifacts that inspired them, and think about their heritage cooking in their lives, and then create works of art inspired by the artifacts and their heritage and heritage cooking. So this then is what they came up with, we came up with. Then my portion was to take the artwork, take the artifacts, design the cases, and then insert the historical narrative that ties it all together. And so the original working title was Let's Eat. But from the direction that we were going, I thought What's Your Flavor actually worked better for the historical narrative. I was going to originally approach it chronologically, but then shifted to a thematic approach and looked at these different cooking ingredients, and then chronologically, historically, how they came into use in Orange County. So if you look at what some people have dubbed the Great Wall of Courtney, because this is where most of our historical interpretation lies, you will see that we divided it into 5 different flavor categories: sweet, spicy, savory, tangy, and salty. And then I picked out some of the most significant flavors within these categories that were being used. Then I did the historical research to find when did people in Orange County, specifically Orange County, first begin to use these ingredients. in their cooking, and found some really incredible and interesting things. I'll tell you just a few of them that strike me. So starting here with sweet, and looking at honey. Honey was the sweetener in the colonial days, but honey was not native to the Americas. So honeybees had to be imported from Europe. So the indigenous people did not have honey. They had other sweeteners, primarily from tree syrup that they were using, but the Europeans liked honey and brought the honeybees over. And actually in the permanent exhibit, we have a skep from the 1750s, a bee skep that you can see in terms of learning how honey, the bees were raised. Also, I love to think about it because the journey from Europe to the Americas could take around 3 months, and you would have these skeps filled with bees on your ship over those 3 months. So I like to think about, the movie Snakes on a Plane, and that in this case, you've got bees on a boat. Ha ha. Back to syrup, then when John Lawson, the famed adventurer explorer of this area, came through in 1701, he noted that the native people had one tree they called the honey tree, another tree they called the sugar tree, and that they were tapping trees. But one of the biggest syrups that I did not know of, being a northerner originally, was sorghum, and how incredibly important sorghum was, especially in the African American community. And you can see these photographs in the Library of Congress's collection that show sorghum production in Carr, North Carolina, which is in northern Orange County. Moving over to spicy, and as I said, we do go through chili pepper, cinnamon, ginger. I did want to point out mustard, because mustard was incredibly important as well in colonial times. The indigenous people thought that mustard was disgusting, and they thought that the people from Europe were madmen to use it. But it was very common. And when you look at household inventories, from the 1700s, you will see that mustard pots are a very common ingredient. Moving down then, next category being savory, just wanted to point out one funny story that I found. Daily Tar Heel, so a lot of these signs, again, keeping everything local and information. Mint being a very popular herb that was used. Daily Tar Heel actually featured a comedic article talking about the reason that UNC was cited in Chapel Hill was because they found so much mint there that they knew they could use that for their juleps. But probably when the university was being cited, nobody knew a thing about mint juleps, but still just a funny story that appeared in 1941 in the Daily Tar Heel. Of all of the crops out there, the most significant one in Orange County is corn. Maize was a staple for the indigenous people here in Orange County, and Europeans were when they moved into the area, they quickly began to rely on corn. It became the most important food crop, and in the 1860 census revealed that 97% of all farms in Orange County were growing corn. So incredibly significant. I love this picture that I was able to find. It was of S.C. Forrest from Efland, and the picture was taken, I believe, early 1940s. Mr. Forrest was 6'8". So you can see how tall his corn was, that it towers over him, and which is pretty remarkable. Last ingredient that I wanted to mention, and as I said, there's lots of information to read and learn about. Tomato clubs were something I had no idea about, but salt. I wanted to talk about salt because salt was so essential. It was the way of preserving meat before refrigeration, so absolutely critical. The other reason I wanted to mention salt was because something that I learned as well. I had originally in my readings read about the indigenous people in this area getting their salt from the east, and instead it looks like they were getting the majority of their salt from the west. And so important in terms of understanding the incredibly advanced trade routes that the Native Americans had long before the Europeans arrived, trading north and south and east and west. So getting some of their salt from the coastal areas, but a lot of them from the salt flats towards the west. So moving then into the actual displays, the artifacts and the art, one of our artists who participated in this exhibit is John Bierman. Many of you maybe have heard his name. He has exhibited at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and all kinds of other really important museums around the country. So we were very honored that he was a part of it. He went into our collection and he selected this one single tea bowl. And I mentioned that it's a tea bowl because it doesn't have a handle. Asian countries do not put the handle on there. That was something the Europeans added. And the reason for that was they wanted, if the tea bowl was too hot for you to pick it up and hold it, then the tea was too hot for you to drink. So when you added that handle, you also added the opportunity for you to burn your tongue. You can see his incredibly gorgeous painting. His inspiration for this painting was the whiteness of the cup. And he did here kind of a study on whiteness. That was his inspiration. Part of the other reason why he was drawn to this cup is that its provenance supposedly was that it was used at the Colonial Inn. Both he and I are a little skeptical of that claim because it's not restaurant ware. It's very thin china, likely to break. So my best guess at dating this tea bowl and saucer is from the 1970s because of the stamping or lack thereof of country of origin and federal regulations. If anybody had been at the Colonial Inn in this and remembers using cups or bowls like that, and you want to send me an email, I'd love to know that, that provenance can actually be verified and that was used in the Colonial Inn. Moving along, another one of our artists who we were thrilled to have join us, Chieko Murasodi, who is from Chapel Hill. And Chieko is an abstract painter, and she was born in Tokyo. And when she went through the collection, she was drawn to this glass Victorian candy dish. So the lid, the top part of the fish comes off and you would store your candy in there. And so it spoke to her and she decided to create a sea for this of candy for this glass candy dish to be swimming in. And looking at her heritage, being Japanese, she was inspired by the Anglo-Japanese style of wave decoration. So that's what this wave pattern is. And it began actually in the Victorian era. So this style of decoration relates directly to the age of the candy dish. And then all of these are Victorian candies. And it's on every side. And if you come around, you'll see that the fish is actually swimming in an ocean that has Swedish fish and gummy worms. So I think that's really quite funny. Moving on then, Anne Hobgood, a Hillsborough artist, who does these wonderful, whimsical folk art sculptures using items that she finds, in thrift shops and other places. So she was inspired by these butter molds, the wood, and created this wonderful folk art carver. And his body is made from different materials repurposed. So his legs are from textile mill spools, but a lot of him, as you can see, is from cooking implements, the forks. You'll see the sieve on his head, and his body is actually an old sugar box. Hannah Dodson. Hanny is another one of our artists here. She has incredibly diverse work, all different types of paintings. She's self-taught from photorealism, like this painting she did for us here, inspired by the cast iron skillets. That actually is a painting and not a photograph. And when you see it, everybody does a double take because they think that the fried chicken, because you can see the bubbles in the oil and everything, they think it's a photograph. But she also did Adam over here, this whimsical sculpture from a mannequin. And as you can see, he's got his apron on and his rolling pin. He's ready to do some cooking. Carlos Gonzalez Garcia is also from Hillsborough. He is a mosaics artist, and if you've been to the parking garage in Hillsborough, right across from Weaver Street, you've seen some of his work. He was inspired by the salt dishes and salt and a salt grain, and created this beautiful mosaic piece inspired by the grains of salt themselves, and then also the patterns in these salt dips, and then other glass pieces that we have. Sonora Lynch is a Haliwa-Saponi potter, and does, as you will see, the most incredible pottery here, using Native American symbols in them. None of her pottery is painted. It's all the natural color of the clay. She adds different materials into the clay to get that black color. When I said heritage cooking to her, she immediately thought of fry bread. And so chose the bread bowl, which you would put your dough in to allow the yeast to rise. And I learned that the wood is the preferred material because it helps the dough heat more evenly. She also chose the rolling pin. And then she was incredibly kind to us and has loaned us for the exhibit this corn grinder back there that her grandfather, a Haliwa-Saponi elder, made and used for many, many years. J.P. Powell is from over in the Raleigh area. When he looked at heritage cooking, he thought about all of the meals that you share and bringing community together, community, family values. And for him, he thought that heritage cooking is a form of generational wealth. So when he was creating his plates here, he was thinking about plates of the past and women of the past, and then modernizing it, and what the modern diverse woman looks like, and again, this idea of sharing a meal and the joys of heritage cooking being as more valuable than anything out there. There are some really interesting artifacts in this case that I wanted to take a moment to talk about, because that was the other component of my work, was finding out all of the history, or as much as I can, about these artifacts. And the museum for many years had just an incredible collection of ceramic dishware. I'll start here. Actually, I'm going to start here with this plate. That plate is, or platter, is actually china. So when we say china, it's called china because it was made in China. The Chinese invented porcelain and held the recipe for porcelain secret for many years. In the 1700s, the Europeans figured out how to make porcelain. And the piece behind it is a very early piece, 1775. This was made by Thomas Turner. And he is the one who, when you think of China, you usually think of willow ware and the willow pattern. He's the one who invented the willow pattern that Spode and Olive and Wedgwood and all the others copied. This platter over here is transferware, made in Staffordshire, England. And this would have been something, so the pitcher was made in 1775. The china platter was made around 1830. This one we know specifically the exact date because it has a maker's mark on it, was made in 1848. This would have been something that a middle-class person would have had because the design would have been etched into copper and then transferred onto a piece of tissue paper and put onto the platter. So the china from China, you'd be very wealthy. This one, you'd be middle class. One more artifact I wanted to point out here is this is a picture from the Buffalo Pottery Company, which was a subsidiary of the Larkin Company. Most people have not heard of Larkin, but they were one of the largest mail order catalog companies in the world, started in 1875. They were the ones, I believe, who originated the MLM, you know, your Tupperware parties, your Avon ladies. They were the ones who had Larkin secretaries who would sell you their goods. If you bought a certain amount, then you got premiums or prizes for it. So they started out just selling soap. And by 1920, they were making, in today's money, around $370 million a year. They were such a big corporation and making such incredible profits that Frank Lloyd Wright actually designed their headquarters in Syracuse, New York. Unfortunately, the building is no longer there. The last thing that I'm going to say before I turn things over to my lovely coworker, our last artist here, Tom Stevens. Tom began in this area as a student at UNC, and he began majoring in children's literature. So he was the last artist to pick his artifacts. And when he came in and talked to me, he said, I don't know what to pick. He said, what do you really want to make sure is in the exhibit? And I said, jam jars and meat grinders, because I had been joking around so much about jam jars and meat grinders. I was like, somebody has to use them. So he included for me the jam jars and meat grinders and made this lovely painting inspired by Maurice Sendak's In the Night Kitchen.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Courtney. So my name is Tanya. I'm the site manager here, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about the external aspects of this exhibit. What Courtney talked to you about was the internal aspects: development, research, curation, and communication with our artists and those that are being featured. But we both also very much agree that any exhibit that is put together has to have a hook for the audience. And so what we actively tried to imbue in this exhibit was active viewership and group communication. And I'll actually start right where Courtney ended, and that's with Tom Stevens' painting. Now, for those of you that are Hillsborough locals, you'll notice by looking at this painting that there are quite a few special callbacks to Hillsborough itself. You'll see that there's a Purple Crow for Purple Crow Bookstore and a little pint glass for the Wooden Nickel Pub. And in fact, our current mayor, Jen Weaver, is in that little yellow airplane up at the top. And so again, this is active viewing. We are asking people to look at this and be a part of that painting. We've created a little I Spy list that you can go down, interact with that painting, and talk with your group about it. And by doing so, it's going to elicit all sorts of background knowledge that you may have, whether that be Maurice Sendak's book, or whether that be that you're familiar with Hillsborough or not. Another way we tapped into active viewing and background knowledge is through recipe cards. Nowadays, everybody tends to find and share recipes online, but it used to be that the way you did it was through recipe cards. Throughout the exhibit here, we have 4 very famous North Carolina-based recipes from North Carolina-based restaurants. You'll see that this, of course, is pimento cheese, a North Carolina staple, and it's from the Carolina Inn. Continuing the theme of recipe cards, we also have recipe cards printed that guests can take home with them. Now, this is actually folding in historical information as well, because all of these recipe cards, we have about 4 or 5 that guests can take, are taken from old newspaper articles. For example, this asparagus with yellow sauce is from the Orange County Observer's August 3rd, 1899 edition. So this is looking at that retro aspect of food and community, how you would share recipes, how you would treasure recipes. This is how you had grandma's cornbread recipe, not necessarily shared through Pinterest. This is also something people can take home with them, so they can talk about the exhibit far after they've left the building. Around the corner here, I like to, and by the way, here's another one of our recipe cards, biscuits from Mama Dip. Very important to include. I'd also like to point out this display here. This is a display of community cookbooks. This is a really important American tradition. And in fact, the very first community cookbook was called a poetical cookbook. And the proceeds of selling it actually went towards the medical costs of Union soldiers. So community cookbooks in America do date back to the Civil War. You'll notice that each one of these cookbooks has a completely different design. That's interesting to look at in terms of the technology and industry that was available at the time, as well as just various social and design trends. Community cookbooks really look at how food is important to community, because not only is it a way to share food with community, it's also a way to gather the food from the community. Very often, it is the community recipes themselves, for example, from churches. The congregations send in their recipes to be a part of that cookbook. You then buy it, and all of their ideas then become yours. It disseminates into the community that way. Because yes, food is an art, but it's also a generational community importance. Going through the exhibit, you get to experience these tastes, these flavors, and here we have a fantastic display that puts it all together, that takes it from the development and the historical aspects into how you would actually consume it. And we have to do a huge thank you to Lindsley Bowen. Lindsley Bowen is from Carlisle and Linney, a vintage jewelry store in town, and she lent us the items for display here. Now, my favorite is actually what you're seeing in the back there. That is a 1930s vintage toaster. It looks very dangerous. Some more of the active viewing and interactivity that we have here in the exhibit actually puts the guests in the steering wheel, or I suppose in the kitchen. And that is here with our For the Win and Fail. Again, playing with the idea of recipe cards, we have asked visitors to share their best thing they've ever cooked and the worst thing they've ever cooked. The funny thing about this is that we see guests come in, look at what guests before them have posted, and talk amongst them in their group saying, oh yes, I've done a popover before, or wow, I had the same issue when I tried to make that. And so not only is this a way for guests to connect with those that have come before them, but to connect with those that come after them. Because very often, once they get inspired, they'll leave their own, and the next group of guests come through and can interact with that as well. We also know that smell is a very important nostalgic memory device. And we have here 4 smell jars that guests can pick up and waft to smell. And each one of these is a different spice. And you have to guess what it is. Don't worry, we do have the answer here in the museum for you. So I talked about the little bit of change historically between sharing a physical recipe card and now we do it through online. Well, there was a different, a parallel experience with botanical illustrations. The botanical illustrations that we have here are from the North Carolina Botanical Garden Program's graduates. This used to be the only way that you could be aware of what a plant, what an ingredient would look like. And that's why it is so important to get these so accurate. This is an intersection, once again, not just of food and art, but of art and history. One of the final components that we put into the exhibit, again, to really promote communication within group members to get the most out of this exhibit, we have 2 quiz sets on the wall. The first here is native or not. You'll see that we have photos of different plants, food ingredients that grow in North Carolina, and we ask the guests to choose which of these are native and which of these are not. Now, I will give you 2 answers. Peaches, not native. Grapes are native. And over here on this wall, under another beautiful botanical print, we have true or false. It is so fun to hear people interact with this panel and to really, they get kind of heated sometimes. It's very interesting to start these conversations. I will give you the answer to number 6, which says North Carolina is one of the leading producers of cucumbers. This is true. And so I hope you understand a little bit more about how there really are 2 aspects to putting together an exhibit. Yes, the development and internal aspects are so important to get something that's professional and that's accurate, but you always have to think about who is this for and how can they interact with it. So again, we focused on that active viewing and communication within a group so that their own background information could be reawakened and they could start to pick up some little thrills and ideas for them to go home and perhaps be inspired to make their own artistic food of their own. And thank you so much for allowing us to do this. I know Courtney and I would love to take any questions if there are any. And we'll be standing by this great wall of cooks that we have here. This is another really fun thing that we put in the exhibit. We asked local chefs about food, what it meant to them, what ingredients meant to them, what kind of inspirations they've had, generational, for cooking and for food. And so it explores how all of them have professional and or personal connections. Again, just another little tidbit for people to walk out of the door and perhaps be inspired.
We're ready for questions.
We're ready for questions.
Ladies, that was fascinating. I love to cook myself, so this is a very cool exhibit, and it was fun to hear you guys kind of talk about behind the scenes. We do have a question. So those of you who are watching, if you have questions or you think of any, please, again, the Q&A box is right at the bottom. So, you know, as we're all talking, you can type anything in. We do have a question right now that says, did the museum already have the community cookbooks, or were these donated for this current exhibit?
So they were all donated actually, and well, loaned. One then donated in the process. So as I was asking around for community cookbooks, somebody came forward and said, oh, well, you've got to have a Colonial Inn cookbook, and gave the museum one of those. majority of the cookbooks that are on display were actually in the collection of the Chapel Hill Historical Society. So we do take very seriously that we are the Orange County Historical Museum, and we do have a special exhibit out right now that is curated by the Chapel Hill Historical Society, and we've been collaborating and working with them, and they were very kind to loan us quite a few of those cookbooks. And then another wonderful source for the cookbooks is Catherine DeMar, and her mother, Henrietta Allman, was the home economics teacher at Hillsborough High School for many, many years. So I shouldn't say it like that, that sounds awful, but for a long time. And she loaned us some of her mom's cookbooks and note cards and things. And in addition to having the recipes here in the museum, I have been trying to post once a week, sometimes every other week, recipes online on our social media, Facebook and Instagram, so that you can download them there as well.
Here's
By
another
the way,
one.
if you have those recipes, feel free to take a photo and share them with us.
Oh, you would love to see how they turned out. So one of the funny ones that I posted online was a recipe for frog's legs from, and I can't remember the exact date, but I want to say like the 1870s. And so I'm guessing that these were probably frogs that they just went out into the pond and caught and cooked.
Probably.
Yeah.
Here's one. Are there any surprising recipes in the cookbooks or that you came across in your research? Maybe recipes that we don't cook today, or
Yes. Now, I'm not going to be able to tell you the exact recipes, but Courtney came up to me with a lot of jellies, all sorts of savory jellies, which I had to cut her off on a lot of times. I would say, please, I don't want to hear that. Lots of meat jellies. There would be vegetables in these jellies, clear aspic, I suppose. That's not really a tradition we've kept, and I'm glad about that. I'm very glad.
Looking at some of those old cookbooks too, you're just like, who ate this?
Well, the thing for me too is when when the board came to me with the idea of heritage cooking, anytime you're looking at history, we have this tendency to look back and romanticize things. And so looking at those cookbooks is a real, eye opener. Most of those cookbooks, date from 1920 through the 1980s. And then, as I said, finding all those recipes in the newspapers. And heritage cooking was essentially whatever meat you had available, boil it and throw anything you had available in there. And the main course really wasn't the focus. The focus was the desserts. So the main course, the recipe is like 2 lines, take your meat, put it in a pot of water, throw stuff in there. But the desserts, they go to town on the desserts. They love the desserts. And that's really where, all the heart and step after step after step goes into. But in addition to Jell-O. So Jell-O was used in all of your salads. And salad, until recently, did not mean green and leafy. Salad meant to add mayonnaise. So egg salad, tuna salad, potato salad, macaroni salad. And then with a lot of these salads, it was mayonnaise and Jell-O.
I cannot.
I think my grandmother ate a lot of that. Here's one. Is there anything you wish that you could have included in the exhibit that you didn't have space for?
Great question.
Well, not so much in terms of having space, but more in terms of just having access to. So we have such a wonderful tradition of restaurants here in Orange County, and like Sutton's Drug in Chapel Hill that goes back, and was hoping to get some artifacts from them. So our last exhibit was crowdsourced. So where we asked people to go in their attics and open their trunks and, bring in artifacts that they had at home. And if we had more space, more time, it would have been great to include more things that the community owned, and that were, heirlooms or special to them. This is the pot that my grandmother always used, or I always, remember dad doing this, or whatever it was. So that would have been great.
Yeah. Is there, I did have a question myself. I have two actually. Is there an ingredient that is common today that was rare back in the day? I know sometimes it's shocking in my own research that you find that, there's a common ingredient that's very inexpensive now that was very expensive in like 1900. But is there some, did you guys find anything like that where there was an ingredient that we use a lot of today, or maybe we don't use a lot of today, that was either common or rare?
Well, I know that there's a lot of talk about vanilla, and not to say that vanilla extract is cheap, but vanilla is thought of as like a common boring flavor, when back in the day, vanilla was incredibly exotic and very, very expensive. So don't just say that vanilla ice cream is bland. The fact that we can say vanilla ice cream is bland means that there's been hundreds and hundreds of years of really intense trading and economics that have made it so accessible. But there's also an interesting thing kind of backwards about nutmeg. Do you want to talk about nutmeg?
Well, I don't know what she's, but specifically, but in terms of nutmeg was very popular in colonial days, and allspice coming, wait, am I saying that right? No, mace, because that's my question in the trivia stuff. Mace is actually made from the shell of the nutmeg, and mace is an ingredient that we don't really use anymore. So I did find quite a few ingredients that we don't use anymore, but I think the most major change dietary is sugar. So in the colonial days, there not being any sugar, to today where sugar is in everything. Sugar is ubiquitous now. And also just in terms of what it took, the human toll that it took in terms of slavery to grow the sugar, and thinking about the history there.
Yeah. I always think too, because like you said, sugar is in everything, but I always think of how eye-opening that would have been to taste sugar for the first time and how much it changed food. I had a professor in grad school who did a study on colonial cookbooks, and she said you can tell when they kind of start importing and exporting sugar around the world, because suddenly, like you said, Courtney, sugar is in everything. And she said before that, it's just kind of bland food. And then suddenly they're trying to put sugar in like every recipe that you could possibly think of, which probably doesn't need sugar. But like you said, I think that would just be revolutionary.
Well, and processed foods, and because of the addicting quality of it, and get you to buy more and more if you load it up with sugar. So
yeah. I did have one last question, and it's, which flavor do you think had the greatest impact on trade?
So I bet Tanya and I are going to have very different answers to
this
one. Right. That would be a very, very difficult question to answer. I would say that you could find, an ingredient in each of the 5 categories that would have been incredibly important. Sugar, as I was saying, just in terms of triangle trade, slavery, molasses to rum to slaves, the triangle, and the West Indies, and so all of the trade routes that developed because of sugar. So if you're thinking specifically there, but then also going back to what I was talking about with salt and the indigenous trade. So before the Europeans got in here, the necessity of salt, not just as a flavoring, but as a preservant, that, going back thousands of years, there was trade salt. And then like during the American Revolution, during the Civil War, the way to, discomfort and maybe take out your enemy was to deny them salt. So during wars, one of the first places that was attacked were salt manufacturing, salt plants. So
That's interesting.
And I would even say, going back even further, of course, in some warfare, you would then salt their fields, right? And so you would also salt to destroy their crops.
That's a really good point.
I know that I personally feel that tea has had huge implications. Again, in the same way that it human toll was taken, but it created these giant industrial trade routes globally between whole countries. And so not only did it have this absolutely mega aspect to it, it also had smaller aspects when you're starting to look at political tea parties and how they can be used, not necessarily the Boston Tea Party, but this idea of a gathering where you're drinking tea, but you're really there to discuss something else. And so I would say that also tea has macro and micro implications for society as well.
That was excellent. Ladies, this was fascinating. If there are any other questions, please don't hesitate. While we're kind of wrapping things up, please don't hesitate to write them in the box. If you also think of any questions later this afternoon or anytime after, please feel free to either call the museum or call the Alliance and we can put you in touch with the museum, or please go in and see the exhibit itself. The museum is open Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And this exhibit, What's Your Flavor, will be up through December. It looks fantastic. We love the behind the scenes. Again, thank you from the Alliance for attending this. And ladies, thank you so much for doing this for us. This is just one in a group of Lunch and Learns throughout the summer. This is being recorded, so everyone who signed up will get a copy of the recording to watch at their leisure, to then also go back in and please see the exhibit in person. It is fabulous, and you will learn a lot about cooking. I always like to just think about, like you guys said, how, again, I cook a lot myself. And so how many ingredients we just still use. And I love to just think about, my ancestors and, Abigail Adams, who I'm clearly not related to, but Abigail Adams using the same food that I currently use today to cook with. And it's just so amazing how everything kind of comes full circle and we're all connected through cooking. So thank you again. We have
Jello and mayonnaise.
That one I'm not cooking in my kitchen. That one I'll leave to the past, but the sugar in Jello I do use. So thank you guys so much. Again, please see the exhibit. And if you have any questions, feel free to call the museum or call the Alliance and we'll get you in touch with these wonderful ladies. Forgive my dog who is currently excited about cooking as well. And he's saying thank you so much. So have a wonderful evening or wonderful day. And we'll hope to see everyone at the museum.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.